What's up, guys? Asian here with another video after a long, well, it feels like a long 1 month hiatus. So, quick update as to what's been going on over the past month. I do remember I said I would make more build videos for you guys, and I apologize that I did not follow through with that. It's just the spark for ESO just kind of went away. Combine that with a couple of other real life things I don't really want to get into right now. I just sort of like flew my mind, and I just sort of forgot about making those build videos, especially because, like I said, I didn't really feel the spark for ESO any longer. Now, there is a new patch out on the PTS right now for the new DLC called Stonethorn. Despite the fact that I have not been playing ESO, I have been keeping up on the Discords and so on to kind of keep up to date with what's happening in the game. This patch notes was something that was obviously raised to my attention through a couple of discords, and just based off of what I was seeing, it seemed like there were a lot of radical changes put into place here. So I figured I might as well cover what's happening with this patch. I'm not 100% certain whether I am going to return to ESO. That spark for ESO is still missing. I still don't have a strong desire to return to ESO, but I will take a look at making more or less abbreviated content, basically. So don't expect 20-minute long build videos. I will take a look at, depending on how I'm feeling, about making these sort of like shorter form videos, basically, that sort of just go right to the point, not really a lot of exposition and so on, not a lot of testing and things like that. I will be relying on the community, the people who I trust, to do the appropriate tests to kind of get some data for me. I will do a couple of tests on the PTS for you guys, but generally speaking, I am not really going to be playing ESO at all, really. I am obviously going to try to keep up to date with the meta, at the very least for this next cycle, this next update cycle, but beyond that, I can't make any promises. But do expect some sort of abbreviated version of build videos once this goes live. But for 6.1.0, the Thorn PTS patch here. So this is a dungeon pack, so you get two new dungeons, Stone Garden and Castle Thorn. And with those come some new item sets. So for Castle Thorn, the light armor set, here, we're just going to be focusing on the 5-piece here. So it increases your spell damage by 372 and increases damage taken from flame and fighter skilled abilities by 10%. So this is a hair stronger than Julianos. Julianos, I believe, is a 300 spell damage bonus, but it does come with the downside of taking more damage from flame and fighter skilled abilities. So it's kind of up to you whether you think that extra 72 spell damage is worth the additional damage taken. Generally speaking, for PvE it is, but for PvP, probably not going to be worth it. But for PvP, there are probably better sets than running this Talfige, I don't know how to pronounce that, Treachery. Unleash Terror, again, just focusing on a 5-piece. When you deal direct damage with a charge, leap, teleport, or pull ability, you cut your enemy, causing them to bleed for 5 seconds, dealing physical damage over duration. So just taking a look at the cooldown as well as the damage that it's dealing, this is going to add roughly 2000 DPS before CP buffs and other sort of percentage damage buffs, but it is tied to charge, leap, teleport, or pull abilities, which most stamina DPS will not be running, so don't really see much use of this, perhaps in PvP, but beyond that, don't really see much use for it. Crimson Twilight. After taking damage, you surround yourself in an 8-meter mist of blood. After 2 seconds, the mist is violently siphoned into your body, dealing 8k bleed damage to nearby enemies and healing you for 100% damage done. This basically just sounds like Leeching Plates. So basically any situation where you would run Leeching Plates or Baraha's Curse, this is where you would probably want to run Crimson Twilight instead. Lady Thorn is the monster helm, so you get max health. Casting ability that costs health spawns a blood ball for 10 seconds. Occur every 10 seconds, can activate the Sanguine Burst energy, you or an ally, dealing 5k disease damage to nearby enemies and applying Major Maim for 5 seconds. You can only receive Major Maim once every 30 seconds. So this will probably tie into something like using Blood for Blood or Blood Altar. There aren't many abilities that cost health out in the game. The disease damage you're getting from acting this energy also seems fairly weak at only 5,000 every 10 seconds, so basically 500 additional DPS before CPs and all that. So I don't see this set being particularly useful in both PvE and PvP situations. Under Stone Garden, whenever you deal Flame Shock or Frost damage, you apply a stack of Flame Shock or Frost weakness to the enemy for 5 seconds. Each stack of an elemental weakness increases their critical damage taken by 6%, but you can only have one stack of each elemental weakness at a time. So it doesn't say whether or not there is a limit to the stack. I'd assume that there is, or it's just a single stack, which doesn't really make much sense. I would hope that there is like some sort of limit to the stack, even if it's just one. Just states you can only apply one stack or whatever. But generally speaking, this might be useful on a support role in PvE. A lot of magic DPS damage comes from flame damage, so you are going to get some additional damage out of it, but I'm not 100% certain how much you'll be getting out of it. I would have to do a little bit of math to kind of figure that out. The medium armor set, when an enemy you've recently damaged dies, you let out a howl, granting 3 allies within 15 meters. A synergy, activating synergy, grants 12 ultimate. Once every 20 seconds, this depends on things that are dying, so not much use in for PvP. Really, maybe in like trash fights, but even then, I don't really see it being all that useful. Heavy armor set, when you drink a potion, you and 3 group members gain 44 ultimates. This can occur once every 30 seconds. This basically works out to be 1.5 ultimate every second whenever you drink a potion. Now, it can occur once every 30 seconds, so you would need to use 3 potion cooldown glyphs in order to use this on the 30-second cooldown, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You are obviously going to be giving up other jewelry glyphs in order to do that. But if you combine this with something like a Nightblade tank, you can get some pretty strong ultimate generation that way if you combine it with your potion cooldown glyphs, for example. So like a Nightblade Argonian tank could potentially make very good use of this set. This is actually not a bad set to consider running as a tank. Stone Husk is the Monster Helm set. Your heavy attacks tether you to enemies for within 10 meters for 5 seconds. Enemies touching the tether take X amount of physical damage every second, and you gain a stack of Husk Drain, up to 15 stacks. Tether is broken when enemies move 12 meters away from you. That can occur once every 10 seconds. When the tether ends, you consume the stacks and gain 30 weapon damage per stack consumed for 5 seconds. And I do note that this is heavy attacks, not just fully charged heavy attacks here. So could be decent as AoE, particularly when the tether ends. So it's for 5 seconds. You gain 30 weapon damage per stack. So max stacks would give you 450 additional weapon damage. So could be potentially useful for AoE as long as things are able to stay within that 12 meters of you. But there might be other better AoE Martial Helm sets potentially, like Marcelock, for example, for Stam DPS. Those are the new sets, so nothing too game-changing here. Maybe the heavy set here for tanks. Maybe the light armor set here under Stone Garden for healers. I'd have to take a look at this one particularly first, see how many stacks there are, and then how much it would affect the actual damage you're dealing, assuming that all of your damage comes from flame damage or something like that. But the big thing that a lot of people were talking about is from basically all the item changes, as well as a couple of class changes here. So under combat and gameplay, this is going to be the kind of focus here. So a lot of issues were fixed. Not really going to be focusing too much on the fixed issues here. But Deep Breath got buffed for Dragon Knights. Both morphs basically got buffed. Draw Essence, you heal more. Deep Breath deals more damage. So Deep Breath might be a pretty decent quasi-spamable for trash. It always has been, but now even more so. Under Necromancers, Detonating Siphon will now occur whenever the tether ends, so now you don't have to wait for Detonating Siphon to run completely out before you use it, so you can recast it a little bit early now. Grave Grasp was changed. I don't think it's still going to be used much, so it spawns 3 areas in front of you. First one snares enemies by 30%, then second area immobilizes, the third area stuns, and it still applies minor maim. So not 100% certain whether or not this is going to really be used still on a support class. It still doesn't seem to be very useful and does require a little bit of situational awareness to be used. So I don't think this is going to be, even though they call it significant improvements, I don't think it's going to be improvements overall to whether or not it's being used at all by tanks, because it is mostly going to be more of a tank skill. Grim Focus now grants 2% crit damage and healing per stack, rather than reducing damage taken by 2% per stack. So Nightblade tanks, you do lose that 10% unique damage mitigation now, but Nightblade DPS, you gain 10% additional critical damage. So that will bump up your DPS a little bit here. Master Assassin, this is probably going to be more for PvP than PvE. But the weapon and spell damage you get is now flat, so it's going to be 258 rather than 10% of your current amount. So that's definitely going to be a nerf, because a lot of you guys running this in PvP will have fairly high weapon or spell damage, and is now granted to damaging attacks against enemies you are flanking rather than granting that amount when you're invisible. So this could be useful for PvE because you will usually be flanking the enemy. Again, we did cover what flanking is in a separate video. So this is going to be, generally speaking, a buff to Nightblade DPS, as long as, of course, you're able to flank the enemy, which you usually will be in the content. Beyond that, not too much here. Strife and Final Health, the damage done was increased a little bit, but it's still not going to be useful very much, both for healers and DPS, obviously. Sorcerers, Crystal Shards, this is something that a lot of people were talking about in the Discords here. So they reduced the cast time down to 800 milliseconds, down from a second. They also reduced the damage done by about 21%, and they reduced the cost accordingly. Now, the two morphs are what a lot of the discussion has been around. Crystal Frag can now proc off of itself, and they did slightly reduce the damage done from the special proc. Now, I don't know if the special proc also got the 21% damage reduction, but the fact that it can proc off of itself basically means you can do multiple Crystal Frag procs one right after another, and that really helps out Sorc Sustain here. So now, we'll cover this a little bit later, but Blood for Blood was changed as well, but the fact that it can proc off of itself basically gives Sorcs a little bit more of a sustained boost this way. Now, Crystal Blast is now going to be a stamina morph, and it basically works more or less like how Crushing Weapon works. So it's an instant cast ability that causes your next light or heavy attack made within 4 seconds to deal additional damage, which is equal to the standard spammable amount here. Plus, enemies hit will have their armor reduced by up to 1,000. So the difference between this and Crushing Weapon is Crushing Weapon has the heal. Crystal Blast has that armor reduction debuff, so that'll be useful to have, but that might not necessarily be very useful, as we'll see later on, based on other sort of armor changes here. Plus, unlike Crushing Weapon, which only applies to light attacks, this also applies to heavy attacks as well. So if you need a heavy attack at all, you're not going to be wasting this compared to using it like on Crushing Weapon, for example. Pets have been, I have to take a look at it, obviously, but they have been buffed. So Rebate now returns magic or stamina whenever your non-ultimate abilities end. So that includes things like Daedric Prey, as well as your Clan Fear, your Matriarch Burst, things like that. So that's another buff, again, to Sorc Sustain. But the big one now is that you use a hybrid of your spell damage and max magicka. So this should act as a buff, again, you gotta take a look at the coefficients, but it should be a buff to pet damage overall. So yeah, pretty interesting first changes for Sorcs. Now under Templar, there was a change to Burning Light, so damage now triggers when you deal damage 4 times within rapid succession to an enemy with an Aedric Spear ability. So this is going to end up dropping Burning Light procs if you're not running things like Biting Jabs or Puncturing Sweeps. Time window is long enough that abilities that hit at least once every second between will continue to proc as passive. So things like Blazing Spear, for example, that will still be able to proc Burning Light, but obviously it's going to be better to just use Jabs or Sweeps because that hits 4 times within that 1 second window. Puncturing Strikes, they reduce the tick frequency down. That's not really going to make that big of a difference here. Then Radial Sweep has a minor cast time. So much like how Incap and Soul Harvest have a very short cast time, it looks like Radial Sweep also got the same treatment here. So this, just looking at the notes here, this seems more of a reaction to PvP than for PvP stuff. So, but Templar DPS, do keep that in mind, though. You do have a minor cast time, so you can't bar swap out of your animation any longer. The next big thing is Ritual Retribution was changed, so you no longer heal from Ritual Retribution. Instead, it just adds more damage instead. So Ritual no longer heals, so Magplars and Stamplars that use this as sort of an additional heal coverage, that won't work any longer. Healing Ritual has had its cost reduced, as well as the amount of healing done reduced as well. It did note that this is going to set a new AoE heal spammable standard, where the healing and cost is 50% more than the AoE damage spammable counterpart, and they will be monitoring this. Lightweaver, the passive was changed, so healing an ally under 50% with any restoring light ability restores ultimate rather than restoring ultimate when healing an ally under 60% health with healing ritual. Beyond that, Healing Seed, the synergy no longer counts as a green balance skill, which makes sense here. Not much else here, just a bunch of issues that have been fixed here. Crit Charge, Stampede now also causes the initial hit to deal AoE damage, not much of a change here. Movable now ranks up in the duration of Major Resolve granted rather than the duration of CC immunity granted, so a slight change here, probably going to be more for PvP. Now Vampire, this is a very, very big change here, and a lot of people were saying Blood for Blood is dead now, so we got to go ahead and look at this. First off, the base Morph Eviscerate, they reduced the Execute multiplier down to 33%. Blood for Blood was reduced down to 60% and now ranks up in 5% Execute scaling rather than scaling in damage. Plus, when you cast the ability, you can't be healed by allies for 5 seconds. So you can no longer use it as spamble because now you can't be healed by other people. So not really gonna be a good spammable overall unless you have a self-heal. So classes that still have a self-heal, a way to heal yourselves, example Sorks with Surge, for example, you will still be able to use Blood for Blood. But classes that were relying on healers to heal you through the Blood for Blood damage, you're not going to be able to use this as your spammable any longer. The new Werewolf, just a bunch of issue fixes, and then the big change that a lot of people are talking about now is Vigor being replaced with, well, not replaced, but Rapid Maneuvers and Vigor have been swapped. So Vigor is now the first ability that you unlock, and Rapid Maneuvers now requires, I believe it's going to be Assault 5 in order to unlock this. Very, very controversial change here. I do appreciate that they're making Vigor easier to unlock, but I also don't like the fact that they're making Rapid Maneuvers level 5 assaults to unlock. So definitely let them know what you feel about this. I have opinions, but obviously I'm just one person. So if you guys do have strong opinions on this, make sure to give feedback, perfectly on the PTS using /feedback or /bug, but you can also give it on the official forums as well. Now for item sets, there's a lot of things covered here. I won't necessarily go through all the armor sets, but I will cover the big ones. So first of all, armor traits. Divines was buffed to 9.1 from 7.5. Impen was nerfed. Infused was buffed. Invigorating was buffed. Nerdhone was nerfed. Well-fitted was buffed. The big one for PvE is obviously going to be Divines. The big one for PvP is going to be that nerfed Impen. Weapon traits, Decisive was buffed, Defending and Sharpen was also buffed, and Precise was buffed as well. So again, the big one for PvE is going to be the Precise buff, and also the Sharpen buff as well, but that might not matter as much as we'll see later on down the line. Jewelry traits, very, very small buff to Arcane, Robust, and Healthy. Bloodthirsty was completely changed, so now it grants up to 250 weapon and spell damage against targets under 90% health, scaling linearly per 1% missing health, rather than granting that flat 10% damage increase at execute range. This is going to be a fairly big change. I already did the math on this, and around 52% is where the inflection point is between Infused and Bloodthirsty. So Bloodthirsty is stronger at below 52% health. Infused is stronger above 52% health. Now the question is, of course, what do you want? Do you want 3 Infused? Do you want 3 Bloodthirsty? Do you want a mix of both? I think part of the answer is going to be dependent on how long an enemy is going to stay within those sort of health thresholds, which shouldn't really matter too much, I think. But there are going to be some fights where Bloodthirsty is going to be better. There are going to be some classes where I think Bloodthirsty is going to be better, especially classes with an execute ability, for example. Swift received a small buff as well as Triune, and Harmony received a nerf. Munderstones were also changed. Atronach and Serpent were both buffed. Mage and Tower were nerfed slightly. These are Mage and Tower was a slight nerf. The Lord was nerfed, very, very small. Lady and Lover was also nerfed, again, very, very small changes here. Thief was buffed just by a little bit. Ritual was nerfed by a small amount, and Shadow now also deals critical healing, but it received a small nerf down to 11% crit damage rather than 13% crit damage here. Now, item sets. Again, I will not be going over all of the changes here, but we will go over some of the big ones. So first of all, radius check for friendly targets to no longer target all allies, but instead target group members only. So this is just a list here. The big ones are obviously going to be Grand Rejuvenation for Master's Restoration Staff, Hollow Fang Stirs, Lord Warden. Basically, a lot of these sets that would cover all allies now only target group members. So if you're like playing PvP, for example, and you have 2 Balzergs going, Ola Remake, for example, will only affect people in your group. They won't affect everybody. So now both ball groups will need to have somebody wearing Ola Remake rather than having just one person for 20, how big are groups? 48 people. Okay, so taking a look here very quickly. Again, we're not going to be covering all of this. We'll have a link in the description below to the patch notes, so if you want to know anything specifically about a single set, go check out there. But under crafted sets, the big one that we're going to be taking a look at is mechanical acuity. They remove the proc chance, so it is a guaranteed critical strike to any ability that can naturally critically strike. So this is going to be a buff now because now you're going to have a little bit higher uptime of mechanical acuity. Whether or not this makes it viable is, I mean, it's always been viable, but how much of a buff this is, it kind of is still up for testing purposes. The other big ones, it's going to be Torag's Pack. Now, this is a typo. Gina Bruno did note that this should be 45%, not 90%. The Torag's Pack did get a buff. They increased the cooldown reduction for enchantments to 33%, which will make a slight difference, but not a huge difference. But the big one is the increase in potency of enchants to 45%, up from 30%. Now, the two-piece is armor rather than spell damage, so you won't be able to use it as a magic DPS any longer. It won't be quite as strong. But for tanks and healers, that additional 45% potency might be beneficial. But beyond that, there aren't really any other major changes, major crafting sets that we want to take a look at. Overland sets, here, the big ones, just want to point out a couple of big ones here. Where is it? Briarheart doesn't have a proc chance any longer, so you're always going to get that 100% uptime now, but they did reduce the heal down a little bit here. Barajas got, just because I know some tanks like to use Barajas like as a traditional sap tank, for example, they did increase the damage done and the proc chance, so it is going to be a small buff here. Bright Throat, because I know a lot of PvP players like to use this, they opt the Magicka regen here. The other thing too here is a lot of these sets basically they just remove the proc chance and they just adjusted a couple of numbers up or down. Let's see here. The big one is another big one is live wire. So they remove the proc chance and they reduce the cooldown. So for tanks that want to keep up good concussed uptime, AoE concussed, live wire is looking really really nice right now. Mother Sorrow got a very very small buff. Plague Doctor is basically just raw health now. They changed the 4-piece to health rather than healing taken. So this is just gives you a lot more health now. Most tanks won't be using Plague Doctor, but it's still nice set for beginner tanks to kind of hold on to while they're learning the certain fight mechanics and things like that. Silks of the Sun is now actually potentially good for Mag Decays because now they changed the 2-piece to Spell Crit rather than max health. Still got to obviously test it out, obviously. Beyond that, though, not much else here to really talk about when it comes to all of this stuff here. Oh, let's see. The other big one, yeah, that's pretty much it. All the others aren't really that impressive. They weren't really used too much. These are probably just a lot of quality control stuff, proc chances, things like that. Dungeon sets, moving on now. Again, not going to cover all of them. Brands of Imperium, because I see a lot of people, beginner tanks particularly, like to use Brands of Imperium here. So you just remove the proc chance and reduce the size of the shield here. So this should be better for overall survivability. Definitely not something you want to bring to vet trials necessarily, but those of you guys who use Imperium, this is going to be a slight buff. Burning Spellweave received a small nerf to the spell damage, but it doesn't have the proc chance any longer, so it's guaranteed proc, so you should see a slight buff. It's not going to be a very noticeable buff, but it should be buff overall to all classes except maybe Mag Decays, because Mag Decays you pretty much already had 100% uptime on Burning Spellweave. But despite the fact that this is a nerf to the spell damage granted, because it is a guaranteed chance now, this should be an overall buff. Calurians, just because I know that still sometimes used in PvP, I think. They just increase the travel speed and increase the damage done and remove the crit requirement for the set. Let's see here. Gossamer, because I know this is sometimes used for progression groups that kind of help reduce damage. They reduce the duration of the set bonus to 1 second, down from 2 seconds here. Now, Hand of Mafal, this is an interesting set. So now it applies minor fractures to enemies in the area of the web rather than for duration after the web explodes. They remove the proc chance, so now when you take damage, a web appears around you for 5 seconds. And they also increase the damage as well. So this is going to be very nice as an AoE minor fracture here, and might be better than Dragon's Defilement, just because it's any damage versus Dragon's Defilement, which is only melee damage. So potentially a good set here, kind of as an AoE tank, just for trash or things like that. Now, Herseens and Worm both now, instead of granting a 4% reduction to your abilities, will now grant stamina or magicka regen. Stamina for her scenes, magicka for Worm, obviously. So definitely a bit of a change here. Hollow Fangs was also nerfed as well. So it reduces, gives back less magicka here. Let's see here. Other dungeon sets. Leeching Plate, the damage was nerfed, but it doesn't have a proc chance any longer. So generally speaking, it's going to be a buff overall. I know some people like to use Leeching Plate, especially in AoE kind of fights as a tank. The other ones here, let's see here. Sanctuary was slightly nerfed, not big of a deal. Here it is, Spell Power Cure. This is a huge change, which actually makes Spell Power Cure potentially better than Olorime in certain scenarios. First of all, this doesn't have a 6-person cap anymore, so it can hit multiple people now. It now grants Major Courage when you overheal, rather than having that chance to proc when you heal them at 100% health. So basically, it just got a nice buff overall. So rather than having a chance to proc when you heal, it will always grant that Major Courage, and it does not have a 6-person cap. So this is a pretty big change here, pretty big power bump to Spell Power Cure here. So hopefully you guys didn't nerf decon it, because now Spell Power Cure does look like it is matching or even exceeding Olorime in certain scenarios. Worm, again, 145 magicka regen rather than 4% cost reduction to magicka abilities. Togvins now that has 5 stacks, but they did bump up the weapon crit that you gain from it. And they did add a half-second cooldown to generating those stacks here. So this is going to be a nerf overall to Togvins here. Undothan, Infiltrator, and Unweaver grant the appropriate stats for their armor weights, so you will not really be able to use these sets any longer. I know I've done plenty of videos showing why these sets are bad. They did buff the set bonus, though, the 5-piece bonus, so it is actually pretty decent that way. But UI, because it now is a medium armor set that grants medium armor bonuses, that might end up making it, kind of negating that additional bonus there. It remains to be seen, though. But UI is still not going to be a very great set, or those of you guys who still use it for whatever reason. For trial sets, big one here, Automated Defense, Master Architect, War Machine, Inventor's Guard. Those now affect 6 people rather than 4 people, and the duration is now determined by amount of ultimate used. So 1 second for every 14 ultimate used. So basically, if you're using it on Soul Harvest or Incap, for example, you are granting 5 seconds compared to if you were to use something like, let's say, the Destro Staff ulti, you'd basically be granting, what's 240 divided? It should be about 15 seconds if I'm doing mental math right. Let's see, 250 divided by 4. So it's about 17 seconds with the Destro Staff ulti. So it depends to be seen whether or not you're still going to want to use Incap or Soul Harvest, because you only get 5 seconds and it takes about 20 seconds for you to get that ultimate back, 25% uptime, but it does affect 6 people rather than 4, so it could be useful here. Reliquins saw a slight nerf here, so you can only get 15 stacks instead of 20. Berserking Warrior grants 305 weapon crit, down from 400, but they increase the number of stacks you can get up to 10, so this is going to be a buff. So originally it was 2,000 weapon crit, now it's 3,050, so this could end up being stronger than Reliquin when you consider the fact that Reliquin now has 15 stacks instead of 20. Again, more testing needs to be done here. False God has received a pretty hefty nerf here. They removed the spell damage from the normal version and the extra 5-piece magicka bonus from the perfect version. So now, False God's not looking too hot here. It's still pretty good for a sustain, but that loss of the spell damage is kind of, or the magicka from the perfect version, kind of a lot of damage that you're losing that way. Let's see here, beyond that, big change to Lunar Bastion. So Lunar Bastion will just refresh the shield rather than stacking it. Now it continues to stack. So this might be a little bit better than something like Imperium, but it does have a longer cooldown now. So might not necessarily, it's still not a very good set to use, but just wanted to point that out, that now it's stacked on each other. Sororia, much like Reliquin, got a nerf in the number of stacks you can get, so 10 stacks rather than 20, and they also increased the amount of spell damage per stack, so 52 spell damage per stack from 30. So instead of 600 at max, you now have 520 at max. But because it did reduce the number of stacks down, this actually makes it easier to use. So while it did lose some potency, it ended up being a little bit easier to use instead. So a little bit of a trade-off there for Sororia, but Sororia is definitely going to be a lot easier for use in sort of more mobile fights now. The other big changes here. So Alkosh deals 3,000. So they changed the way Alkosh works entirely. Set now deals 3,010 damage initially and 11,000 over 10 seconds rather than the current values here. The armor shred is now based on the amount of damage done from the initial hit rather than the flat 3,010. Now this might seem like, oh, well now it's a DPS set, but you have to remember that proc sets are not impacted. Their damage is not impacted from weapon damage or crit chance. It is only impacted by percentage change modifiers, so things like CPs, minor berserk, minor vulnerability, as well as penetration as well. For a tank, it's actually very, very easy just to shift your blue CP points around and maybe run something like the Lover or run a sharpened front bar here. And all of a sudden, you're able to hit much, much higher than that tooltip because it sounds like, and it is confirmed, that this 3010 is the initial tooltip with no bonuses whatsoever. And there have already been tests out there that show that tanks without many changes, just shifting blue CP points around, are easily able to hit 5k or higher damage on that initial hit, which means that Alkosh here got a buff as a tank set. They did not make this a DPS set if that was their intention. This is just, it reinforces the fact that Alkosh is a tank set now, and this might change up how CP points are distributed across DPS because now your armor shred is going to be much higher. You're basically gaining an additional 2k armor shred from Alkosh. Really huge buff here to Alkosh as a tank set. Roaring Opportunist now only affects 6 people. The Roaring Opportunist is now dead. Lachesty's had a reduction in the duration of its buff to 10 seconds, down from 15. So you will need to really time out your synergies. 3 is definitely going to get you the full 100% uptime. 2, you will have to time it in order to get that 100% uptime here. Twice Fanged Serpent received the same treatment that Berserking Warrior got, so now you get a little bit more penetration out of it here. Beyond that, though, Old Rime got a fairly hefty nerf now, so it reduced the duration of Major Courage to 10 seconds rather than 30 seconds, and the max target is now 6 per tick, down from 12. So you can still get Major Courage onto multiple people here, but you can't just plop it down on a single group of 12 people and everybody gets it. Now 6 people get it every second they're in the circle. So 6 people are in it, they get the buff, they move out the next second. Different 6 people can get in, and now they get it, and so on and so forth. If you put it down on a group of 12 people, for example, 6 people will get it 1 second, 6 people will get it the next second. This is a very small change, but this change does make it that Spell Power Cure might be better than Olorime in certain scenarios. In fact, I would say that these two now trade blow for blow, and Spell Power Cure is actually better than Olorime in probably a majority of scenarios, I'd say. PvP, not much here for in terms of PvP stuff. The big thing, obviously, is going to be something like a Powerful Assault, which got a little bit of a change here. So much bigger weapon spell damage granted here, so 307 within 10 meters for 10 seconds rather than 164 within 15 meters for 15 seconds. So more spell damage, but a smaller radius. The other one is obviously going to be Spell Strategist, which got a small nerf here. Borg Tong also grants bonus disease as well as poison damage now on top of the poison damage, so a little bit of change here. And Vicious Death got a huge buff here, so additional spell pen and increased damage done on kill. No idea why they buffed Vicious Death, who knows what they're thinking, but that's what it is. They rebuffed Bloodspawn back up to 13 ultimate on proc, so could still be used here. Rothar would only proc when somebody is within 8 meters of you, and now it is considered damage over time rather than direct damage. Lamrus is now also damage over time, so this does help out Necros because they do have some passive bonuses to damage over time. Prog is now melee rather than damage over time, and then just fix a couple of issues here and there here. Concentrated Force now requires 2 casts to activate, down from 3, so just basically returning it back to what it was prior to Greymore here. The bug fixed where it was proc and burning more often still means that Concentrated Force, the Asylum staff, is still not going to be great to run, but it is going to be a little bit more viable now. And finally, mythic items, Stragglers are now dead. Thracian is dead. So they reduced the amount of spell damage granted per stack. They did reduce the penalties per stack, but now the stack only lasts for 30 seconds and refresh every time you get a stack rather than being permanent. It does grant weapon damage now. But basically, Thracian is not going to be useful for boss fights because it only lasts 30 seconds and you got to get a kill with it. So boss fights with a lot of ads, maybe. Trash fights, maybe. But not for sort of general use blow through a trial kind of thing. The Thracians, they don't look very hot going into this next DLC. That pretty much covers it for this patch notes. A lot of huge changes here, and again, while I will be relying on other people to do some testing, I will jump on the PTS from time to time and show you guys the results of my own tests as well, just to kind of give you guys, so that way you guys aren't just relying on basically third-party information here. Not going to be for everything, but for some things. But as always, link in the description below for the full patch notes if you guys want to see the sets that I did not cover. As always, hope you guys enjoy this video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.